Hi everyone, welcome to week 12, your final week of content related to the ethics course. So congratulations, you've done some great work to plow through this semester, and I have no doubt you're looking forward to the completion of this particular semester. In addition to the content that was provided to you by Dr. Jacqueline Limoges, I just wanted to add a little bit specifically around this last value statement number 7. In terms of being accountable, as well as taking this time to perhaps share with you some suggestions I have for you in terms of preparing for the final exam. Specifically, the article that you read for this week, I thought was really quite interesting in terms of the whole notion about people's senses of accountability and how even our academic preparation or enculturation into our individual professions can really in itself create conflict. And I thought the results of this particular study were quite interesting. As you can see how nurses and surgeons actually view their advocacy role in terms of from their own professional distinct lens, and how that in itself can kind of create conflict within the care setting. So if you looked at the themes here from a nursing perspective, they really saw themselves really truly as that advocate for the patient, whether it's supporting the patient's autonomy, the notion about protecting the patient from the physician, which is really about in terms of treatment decisions and advocacy and having that adequate information. And in the same breath, acting as an intermediary between the physician and the patient. And I know from my own personal experience, this is something that I found was really quite significant. We as the nurses have that distinct relationship with our patients, and sometimes we really do need to act as that intermediary between what is really important to the patient and explaining that to the physician, but also sometimes almost translating what the physician is trying to convey to the patient, and really making sure that the patient is actually making those informed decision making. Whereas the surgeons, it's really about that notion about saving the patient, feeling very responsible for the outcomes, because to some degree they are, particularly in this scenario with surgeons, and really about making sure that they protect that patient from harm. So you can see what I thought was great about this article is just how professional lens, how we're educated in our profession, the stance we have can actually then start to bring conflict together in the practice settings when you bring those various professionals together. What I wanted to share with you, to talk a little bit about this notion of accountability and the various elements that were identified within the readings from your week in the text this week, was just the outcomes of a study that I recently completed with my colleague, Dr. Janet Rush. This was a study supported by the Registered Practical Nurses Association, focusing on the challenges that our nursing colleagues, both RPNs primarily and RNs, experience in long-term care, and the sense of moral distress and how that actually relates to patient outcomes. So I thought I'd walk you through just a tiny little snippets of the study, but then reframe it around some of the key concepts with regards to accountability that were discussed in the text today. So just as a bit of a background, the biggest issue, particularly our colleagues in long-term care really struggle, is those complete, very complex resident care needs. Not a lot of resources and really significant workload issues. And this actually then results in high degrees of moral distress and to some degree job satisfaction. And what nurses find is that because of the complex care needs and the workload, they don't have the time that they would like to be able to spend on things such as reviewing plans of care, updating plans of care, and the ongoing assessment of residents that are actually in their care. So what the RPNAO was hearing from their members is they had this sense of moral distress and frustration because they really felt that the residents were not getting the best of them as nurses. That to truly be able to take advantage of the knowledge that they bring to resident care, they really felt that the residents weren't getting that full advantage of having nurses provide care because of the significance with regard to the workload. So the study, how we focused the study was to really look at the factors that really impacted resident care and nursing satisfaction. And the research questions that we embarked upon were specifically, what are the enablers and barriers to the provision of optimal resident care, and what impacts did these factors have on nurse and resident outcomes? So I'm just going to give you really snippet briefs of the results of the study. So you can start to see, when you start to talk about some of those contextual issues that they mentioned in your text. So this is the resident assignments. So you can see here the average number of residents assigned to a registered practical nurse is 36. which is basically the fact that a registered practical nurse will have custody, if you will, of a single unit. And you see for registered nurses, it's usually more than one unit, if not the entire house. So again, you can start to look at that, how that impacts my areas of accountability, my ability to meet those areas of accountability, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the workload is just really quite significant in long-term care, and how those contextual factors then impact that. Specifically to moral distress, you can see that the moral distress that they experience is quite high. So the scale was 1 to 5, 1 being never, I never experienced this, or 5 being I always experience this. And you can see what's really causing those degrees of moral distress is their inability to almost kind of that fidelity to promise, their inability to kind of keep the promise that they feel that they have to their residents. So where they're experiencing high levels of moral distress is seeing the care suffer because there's not enough staff. They have to rush the care because there's not enough time. Seeing the care suffer due to the inconsistent application of the plan of care, poor communication between team members, or people not having that specialized knowledge. So this is really very much about the context of care and how that actually looks going forward. Some of the qualitative statements I think it's really important for us to have an awareness of in terms of how it impacts us, particularly as nurses, as knowledge-based professions. So some of the comments they also add was that, again, with the increase of the complexity, the need for nursing specific knowledge is now so much more important to ensure that the residents get really good quality care. And they also really clearly articulated that their nursing knowledge contributes to having the ability to anticipate and recognize the changes and then being able to adjust the plan of care based on the patient's or the resident's needs. And very specifically, by having the ability to have time to spend with the residents, then I have an awareness of what's normal. So that for as that baseline, then I can start to know what changes are, and being able to see those in a more proactive manner. And be able to adjust the plan of care accordingly. So again, the importance of not only just the physicality, 36 residents, treatments and meds for 36 residents is just ridiculous. I don't know how anybody could possibly do that. But where the moral distress comes from is that the inability to really to provide that nursing knowledge that we bring. So to be able to truly understand the whole patient. Your text talked about that as well in terms of really understanding the whole patient. So there are the notions again with Parsi and some of the other nursing theorists, how important that is, so that I can know what's important for them, know what's normal for them, so I can then really anticipate and recognize those changes and making sure that their plan of care is addressed really quite well. So where we saw this, which was really quite significant for this particular study, is that we were able to then to link those, the nursing responses to actual resident outcomes. And where we found a statistically significant effect was on this resident outcome that's defined as worsened physical conditioning. So as you can see the definition here, the indicator looks at how many long-term care residents worsened or remained completely dependent in transferring locomotion and other areas of activities of daily living. So it's interesting to note that if you again go back to those contextual issues, significant workload, really complex patients, not having a lot of time to spend with residents, then we can start to see the relationship between nurses' perceived quality of care. And again, if I don't have time to spend with my resident, therefore, I don't have that capacity to anticipate and recognize the changes, they get worse. And this was a really significant impact that we wanted to look at, and we're actually now sharing this on a much broader level, even with the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care and the larger long-term care organizations in Ontario. So this is again how we start to utilize various forms of evidence to actually hopefully to facilitate some change. So if you look at it in terms of the whole notion about, this fidelity to promise, keeping promises, making promises with our patients, and that could be with individual patients or promises overall as my practice as a registered nurse, and that steadfastness, to remain firm in my belief, but also recognizing the constraints. There are constraints to what we can and cannot do, and And that whole notion about, if something doesn't happen or an error happens, is it really reasonable to hold a nurse accountable when the context is actually what's creating some of those issues with regards to moral distress? So the whole notion about, is it, issues of accountability versus those ethical violations, and how does sometimes the context really contribute to some of those particular areas going forward? And specifically in value statement number 7, some of the indicators really also speak about the importance of collaborative practice. So right here, this is point number 4 under the value statement. Nurses are accountable for their practice and working together as part of teams. When the acuity, complexity, and variability of a person's health condition increases, nurses nurses should be assisting each other. This really talks about how amongst that nursing team, registered practical nurses, registered nurses, PSWs, nurse practitioners will focus on the nursing interprofessional team, how important it is that we recognize that when client status changes, that we must consult and collaborate with one another. And that in itself lends itself to the creation of that ethos or that moral community. And the whole notion about fitness to practice. Again, we've talked about this in previous weeks and sessions in terms of our requirement to maintain our own fitness to practice. And that means taking care of self physically, mentally, and emotionally, but also recognizing that if we need to step away, that we have an obligation to do that. And the whole notion of really looking at not only for ourselves, but for our colleagues. But I thought it was interesting, again, your text also pointed out that there's an institutional responsibility as a personal one. So that's why you see a lot of organizations do apply and provide, employee assistant program options that are completely confidential. And so it allows employees to contact those EAP services directly, not through your employer, to recognize when you're having some difficulties and to tap into resources. What we do is extremely challenging work, and I think it's really important that we do recognize when that work is now interfering with our ability to provide really safe therapeutic patient care. So those are just some of the notions in terms of, I just wanted to bring that long-term care study around as a specific example about some of the issues that nurses experience in different areas, but how we actually bring those forward in terms of trying to facilitate some change. So that's it in terms of the content. So what I thought I'd share with you now is just some thoughts with regards to getting ready for the exam. So this is now the week 12 is what you're going into now. So you've got one more set of postings to do. And then next week, there is no further content. So you're done in terms of content. So you've got now a week and a bit to really hopefully prepare for the final exam, which, as you know, is on April the 23rd. So what I would strongly suggest in terms of preparing for the exam, obviously the readings are key. So if there are readings that you did not get to, then you need to get to them. Go through, if as part of your regular preparation in terms of readings you highlight in your textbook or make notes, then and go back to those. What are some of the things that you really pulled out? The other thing I would strongly suggest you do, and in all actuality, this is where you have the benefit, to be perfectly honest, over your colleagues that are doing the course face-to-face. You've got every single weekly class as a recording. Go back and listen to those. I would strongly suggest, particularly the ones for the first 3 weeks or so, when we really started to get into the various ethical theories, those ethical lens, and the various philosophers. So Jacqueline did a really great job of really describing those to you. So if those are areas where you're struggling, go back to them, because you can listen to those over and over and over again. Those ethical theories and those ethical lens, it'll be absolutely key for you to have those down pat in terms of what are the key components, who said what were some of the key principles within those components, and how you can actually then start to apply those in practice. So you're going to get another kick at the can at that. So this week in terms of the postings for week 12, and people you've done well with those particular areas. So keep working on that. So those exercises have been there to give you practice that will hopefully bode you well in terms of to set you up well for your the final exam. The decision-making frameworks are also really important in terms of, how would you go about resolving an ethical issue and some of the key components that go in with that. And obviously making sure that you've got a fairly good sense of the CNA, the Code of Ethics. So not only just the overall arching one, but, take a look at what are some of the indicators under each of those value statement. So you do have a general sense of, from CNA's perspective, what does ethical behavior actually look like for registered nurses. So I hope you find that helpful. Don't hesitate again to post questions within the discussion board. The other thing, as I've said before, although we are a virtual class, if any of you individually or there's a group that you want to get together, I am more than happy to meet with any student at any time if there's specific content area you'd like to go over face to face. So please don't ever hesitate to contact me directly, because I'm more than happy to meet with you individually, to making sure that if you do have some questions about the content, that you do have an opportunity to kind of discuss that face to face. Okay. So I hope you found this helpful, and I look forward to looking to see about what discussions you may bring forward in terms of helping each other to prepare for the exam. Okay, take care. Bye.